All right, thank you very much, Don. As Don indicated, my name is Wayne Collier. I'm the Industry Capability Manager for the LiveCorp MLA Live Export Program. And I'm joined by Ashley, Patrick and Bernie. And today we're going to work through the topic of basically translating or turning market access and compliance into trade, into exports. To try and engage, we've got the exporters up here to focus on what actually happens and talk through how those things actually roll out in practice, rather than spending the time talking through the regulations or the market access stuff in a great deal of detail. So to start, what I will do is just go over at a very high level, so that we can focus our time on the discussions, is just the key market access and regulatory components that we just need to be aware of with this discussion. So, I'm pointing this. All right. So firstly, market access, it's obviously a critical element for the trade. And for livestock, we're really talking about the key document being the health protocol. And a health protocol, basically, it's an agreed set of conditions that are set by the Australian government and the importing country government through a negotiation process. And within that, those conditions are basically, there's some on the next slide, but basically those are required to be met for an export to proceed, and in turn for an import to be accepted in the importing country. And I think that's an important distinction to make, in that we are talking as much about, if not more, about the import of livestock as we are about the export of livestock. So when we get a protocol, it has to factor in the biosecurity concerns of the importing country, and it also has to factor in the practical components that are necessary for the trade to actually commence. So we're lucky in that regard, in that when there is a negotiation for a protocol to get market access, Australia has excellent health status, and that's one of the key things that allows us to try and change those and get better conditions. And so the focus is to get that recognised in what's agreed. The secondary elements, certainly from an industry perspective, for it to be workable, they have to be costly, they have to be clear, practical, and as much as possible align with the systems and the practices already in place. However, with any negotiation, obviously the ultimate health protocols end up being a representation of the two interests. But because you can get that balance, you do achieve workable conditions and you have trade proceed. But it does mean that they're not always perfect. So those protocol conditions themselves, that's one component of what we'll focus on today as we build the key elements that go towards a livestock export and trade. So these are just a quick run idea of what some of the elements that could be in those protocols are. So you have country freedom, disease statements, you have vaccinations, testing, things like that. We'll go through those in a bit more detail. Regulation, again, very quickly and very high level, just so that we have the context. The Australian livestock export industry is heavily regulated, and it's regulated basically from the farm of sourcing right through to the point of processing in the importing country. There's two key elements to it. There's the Australian Standards for the Export of Livestock, or ASIL, which covers from the farm through to basically to the discharge in the importing country, and then ESCAS, which covers from that point of discharge through to processing. ASIL is, as you can see, it covers preparation, sourcing, land transport, registered premises, and the voyages themselves. And it covers a range of key welfare requirements that's quite prescriptive, but it covers things like minimum times in registered premises, stocking densities, and has a focus on inspection and removal of animals on the basis of fitness to export. Turning to ESCAS, I'll probably flick through quickly. In terms of ESCAS, it applies to feeder slaughter livestock only, and it covers from discharge through the elements of the in-country supply chain, feedlots, abattoirs, and the handling amongst those elements. ESCAS is based around four key components or pillars. There's animal welfare, obviously, which is based on 32, 33 requirements, standards, which are based on international animal welfare recommendations. The second element is control and traceability, where exporters are required to be able to trace livestock through their systems. and ensure that those livestock remain in approved facilities. That's backed up through validation through independent third-party auditing of the facilities, and they're focused on confirming that the welfare and the control and traceability standards and requirements are being met. And then that feeds into the reporting into the departmental oversight and monitoring role of the exporter systems. So that's the very high-level overview of those key elements. But as you can see, they're only part of what goes into it, and there's also state territory requirements, and then the commercial side, the customer specifications. So what we're going to try and work through today with the exporters is to get them up and talk through each of those elements and how they actually play out in practice. So firstly, I'd like to ask Ashley James from Frontier International to come up and talk through how protocols work through in practice.
Do you need this, mate? Can drive that? Yeah. Thanks, Wayne. We'll just speak about the protocols for country, and obviously there's a lot of different protocols depending on which country we're going to. Wayne would probably be the best person to talk about this, as he pretty much wrote it. But anyway, I'll go through it. And because China is where we see all of us in the future hopefully doing a lot more business, and it's the latest protocol, so it's what I'll touch on today. So once the government, Australian government and the Chinese government have agreed on a protocol, which takes a lot of time backward and forward of what they'll give up and what we'll give up, and once it's in place, so we have the China slaughter protocol. I think there's probably two or three air freights have gone there. I don't think a livestock vessel's gone up there yet, but so we've done one air freight. The first part of the protocol is the cattle that we must supply must have a residency of 3 months. So that just simply means that any animal before they come into quarantine must have done a minimum of 3 months on a farm. Cattle traders are usually out of us buying from to go to China. From there, prior to part of the protocol is then we nominate where we're going to purchase our cattle from, off what properties, and supply a list of pick numbers to the department. And then that's when CIQ, which is the Chinese equivalent of Department of Agriculture, step in. This protocol is very heavy between both countries. So Indonesia, Vietnam, we don't have the amount of interaction we have with China with their Department of Agriculture. So one of the other parts of the protocol is we must be supplying cattle from blue tongue free areas, and Wayne was kind enough to find a map for me. So you can see that cuts a lot of Australia out for supply of cattle. And I will talk about a pure slaughter market, which really means high 400s to a 500 kilo plus steer as what they want. So first of all, we have to take them out of that blue tongue free zone. The next part of the protocol is that they be HGP free, which again, these two things are making it very hard for Northern Australia to supply China, and hopefully with further negotiations we might be able to get around that, but at the moment it's a southern business. The challenge is finding enough supply of a 500 kilo animal that's HGP free, and obviously, as everyone probably knows in the room at the moment, the cattle prices are extremely high, so the supply is actually one of the hardest parts of putting this all together. The next part of it, then we would have a meeting between the Department of Agriculture and the state that we're shipping out or flying out of. So say it's Melbourne, we would go down to the Victorian Department of Agriculture with the Chinese vets. They have already been supplied a list of RFIDs for all the cattle and property of origins, and then they'll sit there and might throw out, I don't know, 5% of the consignment that they will give to the department, and they will physically check where those cattle have been just to make sure the residency is correct. And then they can tick off on that, and then we would usually get a letter to say, okay, you can start the quarantine period. The quarantine period for slaughter cattle is 7 days in quarantine, but one of the requirements at the moment is 7 days prior to cattle entering quarantine, that quarantine facility has been free of cattle and is clean. So this is one of the problems that exporters find to be competitive in this market at the moment. We're finding that once we hit the quarantine you really have to have cattle. You're paying for 14 days for a yard when you've only really got cattle in there 7 days. But if you're a facility owner, they're obviously, if they're going to leave something empty, they're going to want to be paid for it. And at the moment, all these costs to comply is making it uncompetitive for us. So, and just to give you an idea of some of these costs, to hit the protocol for a Chinese slaughter animal is around about $160 a head. And to give you some of the idea, the trucks have to be washed prior to arriving at the farm to deliver to quarantine. All the animals must go through a footbath at entry into quarantine. We must have the quarantine facility must have a dust mitigation plan to keep dust down. The AAV, which is the accredited veterinarian, which is a third-party vet, must do daily inspections of these animals while they're in quarantine. There must be a manure management plan, the 7-day spelling, and they also have to be, Chinese have to have audited the quarantine to approval for them. So that all comes at a huge cost, and at the moment it's sitting around $160 a head. So then we move into the preparation, which, Chinese government oversight and preparation. So part of that oversight is what I spoke about earlier, where we go to whichever department it is, sit down with the Australian government, Chinese government vets and the exporter, and test the information that we've been passing on. It's heavily scrutinised by Chinese vets, which means in turn that the Australian government or Department of Agriculture heavily scrutinises the same process. But it's a lot of lead up time, but once we get to this position, it's very well managed as long as everything's right. And that's held, so CIQ, DAF, importer. The Chinese actually spend a lot of time in the quarantine. They'll be going out there for daily visits. And then once it's all happened, it's really just a pour on internal, external parasite as they go out of the yards or onto the plane or onto a ship. But it's all the lead up at the moment. And yeah, so we'd like to see this market move to the north. Whether it does or it doesn't, I think we're still a long way off, but we're all hoping that we can make China worth, whether that's out of Melbourne, Adelaide, but I think only time will tell, and a lot of that is due to the protocol. So, Wayne? Oh, that's you?
So just a couple of photos of that shipment arriving. So Patrick's, Ashley's talked us through the preparation of a China consignment. Just to throw a question maybe at Patrick, Ashley's worked us through the requirements for quarantine, 7-day quarantines, Chinese government oversight, things like that. How does that compare to Indonesia or Vietnam? in terms of the protocol, meeting the protocols for those?
Look, Indonesia and Vietnam are very simple. The cattle just have to be 1 clear day in quarantine, essentially arrive free from tick, and obviously I'll run through some of the ASIL requirements, but protocol-wise it's a backline onto the ship, and there's a good trust factor between the respective governments, so there's just not the oversight required by the importing countries.
Yep. And so I suppose a quick question maybe to Bernie. We looked at, I talked earlier about the importance of aligning protocols with practices, and obviously the more treatments you have, the more you have to bring animals through and things like that. How important is that when you've got protocols being negotiated to try and minimise some of that handling and line things up?
I guess one of the biggest things with the China protocol is the distinction between a feeder and a slaughter animal and that market. And traditionally our export markets start off as a slaughter market but very quickly progress to a feeder market, and that's basically for sustainability, or to be able to remain viable going forward, to get that value out of the feed that the feedlotting gives. With the China market as we see it, you know, the slaughter job is going to be probably the first one that we, you know, as has been the case with the air freights that Patrick and Ashley kicked off. But when we start moving into sea shipments, you know, these guys are going to be killing animals up there inside 14 days. The whole shipment has to be slaughtered. So from a AQSIQ point of view and from a Department of Ag point of view in Australia and ourselves as exporters, we need to be very mindful of that with the slaughter protocol for China, is that every additional handling of an animal here at this end increases the likelihood of bruising, significant bruising, not only in the depots but obviously then on the boat. So whereas with a feeder animal we don't have that, we've got 100 to 120 days in a feedlot, we can get that bruising out of the animal. So I think we haven't done the trade yet by sea, but I think that's going to be one of the biggest things. Is there's going to be some little nuances there around that handling of that animal, making sure that we're not handling it too many times that increases those chances of hematomas and deep bruising, because they're going to get killed in 14 days. So we can't afford to get this market wrong and have an animal up there that is arriving, getting killed in 14 days, that's got bruising, it's black and it's blue, and so it'll be critical.
Yeah. One of the other things too around that is the 14 days. That's where I think China seems to maybe have a little bit of bend in it. So with our shipment, our importer was able to get an extension on that 14 days and was able to get a couple of extensions on it. So maybe that's just in the long term, you know, for shipping especially, as Bernie just described. I think we're going to need that extra time just to be able to slaughter the cattle.
Yeah, I mean it highlights, I guess, with new markets how much of a learning process and development process it is as you actually set up those supply chains. And that's sort of the next slide we've got is just around quickly on the commercial side. It's obviously an important part. You get access, it opens up the door, but you have to be able to get in there at the right price and that sort of thing. Just quickly, once the protocols agree, when do you start talking with a market about getting, or with the customers in the market to try and get in there? And what type of things are you sort of setting up in that process?
Well, with the air freight we were talking to the customer 12 months before. I mean, the new markets, there's a lot of people out there with ideas but don't have the facilities. So I think every exporter spends a lot of time and money with these customers. So we had a lot of work, a lot of help gave them a lot of help in feedlot design, abattoir design, countries where they could purchase the hardware for the abattoirs, the system. So that can be 12 to 18 months out, because then, you know, they have to be around SCAS. So yeah, it's not just walk into a country, meet someone, sign a contract and put a boat on the water in 2 weeks. It's in new markets, it's minimum of 12 months and probably closer to 2 years.
Yeah, and we saw that, I suppose, with the Cambodia shipment as well, which was the year after the protocol was signed. So moving along, we've covered off on the market access element. The next element moves us into regulation, and for that I'll ask Patrick to come up and say a few quick words around that, and then we'll have some questions again.
Thank you. I will be a little bit quicker. Ash can talk a bit. So look, it's good to see some producers here. I'm from a producer background. I grew up on the West Australian border in the Northern Territory. My family had properties up there for 50 plus years. So I apologise about the reasonably dry topic you guys are getting straight up around the legislative requirements of live exports. But I'll run through it briefly, and I'll try and just pick out a few elements that'll be of particular interest to you guys as producers. So I now run North Australian Cattle Company. We do about 130,000 cattle a year based in Darwin, about 80,000 to Indonesia, about 40,000 cattle to Vietnam, and we're doing about 10,000 to Malaysia. So typical of a Northern Australian exporter going to those short haul markets. You know, it's been a pretty tough slog as a live exporter. It'd be, you know, fairly common news you can read about in Beef Central, but obviously the prices of Australian cattle and our ability to now deliver livestock at competitive prices into those markets is getting very, very difficult, particularly in markets like Vietnam. Any of those markets that have access to other cattle, you take a Vietnam, for example, they can buy cattle from Thailand, Laos, Cambodia. They don't have to take Australian cattle. So there's very much a slowdown in numbers. The last couple of days with LiveCorp and ALEC, we've been looking at our forecasted figures going forward, and we see numbers coming right back. If you see any guys with their sort of head down and potentially tears running down their eyes, that'll be the ship owners. There's 2 or 3 of them here, but look, at the moment they've had a pretty good run of it with their vessels sort of on full-time time charters. But certainly at the moment there are a lot of people are giving back ships and going back to doing business when there's a good commercial outcome. So look, I'll just run through how we go about doing a particular consignment. I'll talk particularly about ACEL. ACEL came about I think it was in 2003. When I think it was Warren Truss at the time commissioned a review of livestock exports. So John Kennery undertook a review and came up with these Australian standards for the export of livestock. They've been finessed and worked on over the years between the government and the industry to make sure they're workable, updated regularly. There's a lot of R&D and science in behind them to make sure that they are not only are they cost effective, but they result in good animal welfare outcomes. So commercially, we try and do we'll try and sell cattle at least a month in advance to our customers in market, because of course, we spoke about protocols earlier, but ultimately we're in sales, so we need to find a buyer up there, then we have to find the cattle, and then we have to put it in line with our shipping. So 10 working days out from export, we're supposed to enter all our information into an online application and approval process with the Australian government, so that's called TRACE. I say 10 working days, that's been quite a challenge of late. If you look at, for example, the Indonesian import permits are very slow to come out this year, only just dribbling through now. So to try and put 10 working days out knowing exactly where your ship's going, to which customer, which yards and what cattle, all of which has to be entered into TRACE, has been somewhat difficult. Thankfully, the Australian government, I saw Stacey McIntosh earlier, but we'll see some of them at the barbecue tonight. They've been working fairly closely with the industry on this. So that's what we do 10 days out. Just if you click over there. So the good thing about this is that it's instantly being online. It's processed in Canberra, and it's also by the local AQUIS government, and so it's regularly updated all the time, and that's the system. So there's a drop down boxes, fill in the gaps type thing, and then you're assigned an LNC number, and that's the particular number that's associated with that consignment and with those cattle. So ACEL starts on the farm for sort of on-farm selection and sourcing and inspection. Now there's 2 things here. Firstly, there's the commercial requirements that our customers require. So whether they want steers, heifers, weights, age, breed, etc. That's obviously a commercial arrangement. But then under ACEL, there's another line of rules and regulations, and just some of them are up there now. I'll just run through a couple of them, like the pregnancy status is obviously an important one for us. All animals have to have been preg tested within 30 days of export it's by a vet in most of Australia. There's still some of the territory, and might be Western Australia, where you can use an approved accredited preg tester. Horns are very important. Anything with horns longer than 12 centimetres has to be designated an extra 30% space on a ship. And when you look at the cost of vessels, that's a significant cost. So it might cost us an extra $100 to $150 to move an animal with 14 centimetre horns. So if you get an exporter who comes up to you and wants to discount you for having horns, he's doing it for a good reason, because it's costing him significant money to deliver that horned animal to market. But all of these come about a fit to load, and these are the on-farm selection. You know, some of the times you'll have, we take selectors out on the farm. A lot of the times now we're sending out, as exporters, specifications to our buyers, often our agents, and we'd like them to follow them, because I tell you what, when cattle come into yards and they're not to spec, it's quite a difficult process, particularly in a place like Darwin. I mean, now there is a processing facility up there. Obviously, AACO have got the Livingston facility there, but for a long time, if you sent cattle to Darwin and they didn't get on the boat, they were nothing but, you know, they were a big cost and a long way back to the farm. So it helps to put out, for us to put out clear parameters, and it helps if they all meet the ASIL requirements. Again, look, a lot of paperwork. I guess the most important thing for us is an import permit. So the import permit is issued by the importing country's government, which is them saying that we will allow the import of the cattle on the import permit. So it might say, you know, Australian cattle, you know, 5,000 head of steers type thing. So that's, the minute we've got that in our hand, we know that that importing country is approving for that importer, you know, the importation of those livestock. So after that, there's a whole lot of paperwork that needs to come with the cattle. So our declarations are on-farm stuff, your pregnancy certificates, NVDs, waybills, property of origin clearances, they all need to come with the cattle, and every single animal must have one. And unless every single animal for a consignment, so a typical shipment for us might be 4,000 head, if there's 10 in that consignment that, you know, are missing a preg testing certificate, or you know, or something like that, one of those bits of paperwork, then you can't get, you know, you won't get permission to leave for loading, and the whole consignment gets held up. So there's just a few of the other ones there around, you know, the yard isolation, individual weights. We have our own AQUIS accredited vets or approved veterinarians. They have to sign off on everything, and before we can get a permission to leave for loading. And then obviously once on board, there's another whole lot of paperwork done again there around, particularly around the commercial side of it, bills of lading, manifests, obviously paperwork around our exporter instructions for fodder and water, health certificates, permit to exports, a lot of them. One more. So, well, I'll just talk a little bit more about on the vessel. Obviously, for long haul, we need to have vets. When I say long haul, I mean greater than 10 days. But short haul, we have our own accredited stockmen. They've all done a stockman's course, and many of them have made their lives sort of plying the trade and travelling with their cattle. And they're a very, very, very crucial part of our team, being our eyes and ears on the boat. But when you charter a vessel, you get a full livestock working crew on there. Cattle have 24 hours access to feed. They're fed 2 or 3 times a day, giving them access to feed and water. The big thing about is stocking densities. That's based on weight. It is based on also, there's a little bit around breeds and destinations and long haul, but predominantly it's around, you know, smaller animals obviously need less space on a ship, but it's very heavily regulated. That's a typical ship checklist that we have for just one, you know, just a single shipment. So we'll end up with a folder that's probably 2 or 3 inches thick that'll contain all those documents. And we need to have all those in order. We can get part of the conditions of holding an export licence is that the Australian government can access any of those folders at any time, wanting to know, you know, wanting to see every single bit of information and paper in order. Oh, those last 2 slides were sort of, good presentation, did Wayne. I think I've run through that. I guess the reporting requirements, you know, continue on board the vessel. So the stockman does a daily report, and that you know through the ship owners comes back to the exporter, and then obviously does an end of voyage report, and all those end of voyage reports have to be submitted to the Australian government. And that's typical cargo plan. That's obviously all done, once our cattle are in and we know, know weights of cattle and types of cattle. It's like loading a truck. Obviously, there's common sense. We're loading similar size and similar type cattle together. They'll obviously travel a lot better. So you might end up having, 6 and 8 different lines of cattle, and they'll be loaded often as best for the cattle. You'll often have big, heavy bulls, for example. Will be last on, first off because they're less nimble. But it's obviously all about the ship stability, and it's done with the ship's master, with the captain, with the government, with the exporter for the best results. I think that's all I'm doing.
Yep. All right. So I'll move along fairly quickly, but just quickly to touch on, you spoke about things like pregnancy status and horns and things like that. Just generally, what's the biggest thing that you see coming into the registered premises that's a rejection issue? What happens with those, and how much of an impact does that have on an exporter? I don't know, Bernie?
From a rejection point of view, pregnant females, it's a huge one. It just continues week in, week out. And as Patrick was alluding to before, those sort of animals end up sort of stagnant in the system and choke up yard space and make it very difficult when you've got quite a number of different vendors. For a consignment, if you've got a large boat and you've got half a dozen clients and they've each got 3 or 4 individual lines themselves, well, those sort of animals cause a lot of problem, but it's ongoing. So pregnancy is a big one. The other big issue for ourselves is the last 24 hours is critical. It's mayhem, and the hoops that we have to jump through in order to present the paperwork 100% compliant up to the Department of Ag, to the Slevo on the day. And one of the biggest frustrating things is the lack of getting that paperwork that's required from the vendor, which is the pregnancy vendor declarations, it's the property declaration, the disease freedom. And there's nothing worse when you're sitting in the last 24 hours, you're trying to get your cattle inspected, you can't get a leave to load, and you're still trying to chase an agent or a producer. That's probably the 2 largest things from our perspective that are really compound.
Yeah. One of the difficulties around the pregnancy declaration is that now a vet or a registered preg tester must NLIS scan. He must have an NLIS scan of all the cattle that he's called empty or she's called empty. Then they also have to sign every page of that document along with their certificate to say they're empty. And Australia's a big place, so they might go into one yard, they'll scan it, scan the cattle, they'll draft them out. They're the empty ones you can send, but it might be 3 or 4 days before he gets back to a hotel or Wi-Fi, and that's where this sort of, your last 24 hours prior to loading can become. Now we all try to have that paperwork, 3-4 days prior, but sometimes you simply can't get hold of a vet. He knows he has to do it, but he may be 48 hours away from. And we've had it before where we've just had to leave 6 or 12 decks of heifers behind because we haven't been able to get a pregnancy declaration. And the other one earlier, horn, is the big one. So you'll send it in, and if it might only be 2 centimetres, but if it's longer than a notebook, an Elders or a landmark notebook, it's out, and that's 30%. So 2 centimetres can end up costing you $120 a head.
I was just going to say, I think one of the biggest issues from all exporters, but I'll say from my side, has just been supply at the moment. Like, it's just really difficult to find good numbers of cattle, that are suitable for live export. So, right across the north, it's a seasonal thing every year, but this year in particular, because so many cattle are going back into Queensland on the grass there, it's just really difficult at the moment to find a full shipment of cattle. So that's a dead freight is a big cost in this industry. There's no margin in it whatsoever. So to not fill your ship is a problem. But of course, we have to keep our cattle quality up and we have to keep our standards up, and so we don't want to be in a position where we're accepting second and third grade cattle to fill a ship. We don't want to do that for our customers. We don't want to do that for animal welfare.
Thanks. Now, I'd like to ask Bernie up now to give us a presentation overview of ESCAS into practice.
You want to drive that? Wayne? Thanks, Wayne. Yeah, I'm obviously employed by Wellard Rural Exports. So ESCAS in practice. I guess in a nutshell, if we move to the first slide, Wayne, it's all based on the RFID, on the NLIS database. So, you know, that provides exporters with individual lifetime traceability of an animal from the point of where we load through to the point of slaughter at the other end. So it essentially just consists of obviously an NLIS tag. We've got a scanner. In the case of, and what you need to understand here is that each exporter has got a different system. We all operate under ESCAS, however, we all have a different individual system that we've developed for the means of tracing our individual traceability for our animals within our own companies. So what I'm showing you here is obviously Wellard's is what we've developed, and this one in particular is what we use in Vietnam. And this has evolved from the original ESCAS just because of the, I guess, the higher need. You'll be aware of some of the issues that have been in the market in Vietnam. So this is just one that we've had to continually develop and evolve. It's quite simple. NLIS tag, as I said, your handheld scanner at the point of slaughter. We've got an Android phone, which we use for taking a photo. That photo of the animal at the point of slaughter is GPS. It has a timestamp on it, time, date, GPS, and also it scans the RFID of the animal at the same time. So we have actual physical proof of the animal at the point of slaughter that we can confirm back through our traceability. That at the end of every night's slaughter, it's just basically loaded up, and the AWA for that facility, each individual facility, emails that through to our supply chain officers, and that must be sent through by 7 a.m. On our standard. 7 a.m. every morning. If it's not, we're on to them saying, where is it? Why haven't we got it? What's the problem? It goes to our supply chain officers, and then they load it up and stick it into our database that we've developed for ourselves. And like I say, every exporter's got a different traceability system that suits their purpose. Just a little bit further on getting ESCAS going in market, we have an internal, we adopted an approach where we complete an internal audit ourselves as a company ahead of getting an independent auditor in, which is required to get final approval. So we just basically operate on a red, amber, green traffic light sort of system. So we'll go in and do an internal audit and make sure that we believe the facility is actually going to pass go with the independent auditor before we progress it. So if it doesn't stack up in regard to the lairage, as ample water and feed supplied, protrusions that could injure cattle, the knocking box and the angle of the floor, all of those sort of things. It's got to stack up for ourselves first, so that gives us confidence, so that we're not wasting money sending an independent auditor in there only to find out that it's not passed, and then we've got to go back and do more work, get the independent auditor back again. So it's just one of those things that I guess we learnt the hard way in the initial round of things, but that's the quickest way that we sort of have found to do it. Once we've got our independent audit done, our internal audit done, then we get our independent audit. We use a company called Control Union. There are a couple others, Global Compliance, and each company's got their own auditor, independent auditor. So once that independent auditor's been in and completed their checklist, well, then it goes back and gets submitted to the Department of Ag in Canberra for final approval. So, and once they've got we've got the green light, that's added to our supply chain. Just a little bit around the cost of ESCAS as well. To give you an example, and every exporter, once again, I'll just speak for Wellard, but everyone's sort of different. we allocate in our budgets $6 per head towards covering SCAS costs. So for the last 2 years, 14 and 15, Wellard exported 330,000 head of cattle. So basically about 1.98 million is what we've invested in SCAS in market to make sure that we've got somewhere to for Australian producers to send their cattle. That's gone up from $4 previously that we used to do a couple of years ago. And the reason that it's went up from 4 to 6, we made a move. The cost of that increase has been a direct result of the Vietnam market, the extra resources that we've had to put in there. And so SCAS between each market is not necessarily the same because the customer and the clients are different. With Vietnam, for an example, we've had to add another level of scrutiny and implement and develop a more robust system that we've got 100% confidence in, that we know exactly where our animals are every day of the week. Next slide, Nick. So just an example, this is just an example of a standard pack that we provide to all of our abattoirs. So, we've got about 70, 80 odd abattoirs within our system in Vietnam alone. But that just basically, the standard operations procedures for animal handling, effective stunning. I've got a visitor's logbook. All people visiting the abattoir must sign in and out. There's a handheld scanner. You've got your Android phone. There's a repairs and maintenance log. So any repairs at the AWO, it's his responsibility to make sure that if there's any breakages in the system, holes in panels on the knocking box or anything like that, that they are repaired and carried out in a timely manner. Matador maintenance, the stunners, handheld stunners, that there's regular maintenance of those as well. And even things down to a stock take on the power loads that go with those stunners to always ensure that there's enough power loads on hand for that night's kill, and that we've also got a backup stunner. So there's always 2 Matadors in case the first one doesn't function. You would have seen there in that previous slide, there's AWO has to be present. Each exporter has to have an AWO present at each and every abattoir on every night that they have cattle being slaughtered through that facility. They're individually identified by a coloured shirt. In our case, one of ours is yellow, so that's actually been seen by a lot of the guys up there that are performing that animal welfare officer role. It's a sense of pride wearing that shirt. It distinguishes them in the market, in the abattoir on the night. But they are there to ensure that the animal handling is done correctly, that cattle brought up out of the lairage into the knocking boxes is done effectively, that the slaughtering and the stunning technique is effective and done in a timely manner, and also that they're responsible for the actual traceability scanning of the animal upon the point of slaughter, and ensuring that traceability flows back to our supply chain officers. So some of the, I guess the technology that obviously we use, so the feedlot and abattoir on the left there, you can see that's for the feedlot. That's just a panel scanner. We've got our software and we've got our computers, laptops that the feedlots have to have in place for the purpose of tracing cattle into the feedlot. So it's no different to receiving cattle into your export yards, into your pre-export quarantine yards around Australia. Everything has to be scanned in, 100% compliant. And on the right there is the equipment that we use at the point of slaughter. So we've got a handheld scanner. That's a little data Mars that we use. They're about $600 a pop. Well, a bit more than that, but 600. You've got an Android phone, and then we've got our database and internet, which sort of are the modes from which we upload and maintain our control and traceability. This is just an example you can see here of the data that is just uploaded. As I said, we have a standard that by 7 o'clock every morning we want the previous night's kill emailed through to our supply chain officers. That's provided to our admin staff, and this is just an example of that RFID information that's transferred and uploaded by every animal welfare officer every morning. Just finally, as part of the the tools of the trade, I guess you would call it. On the photo on the left there, you can see this is a photo app that we use. It's equivalent to your mobile phone. But you can see that it's running down the left-hand side there is just basically, it provides the GPS coordinates, the date and the time. We make sure that every night before slaughter begins, our AWO officer, which you can see there in that photo, he has to present himself in front of the CCTV that's installed in the abattoir. He has to present and show that all the tools of the trade that he needs for that night are present. So you can see on the ground there, on the left, he's got 3 cattle talkers to make sure that cattle are brought up from the lairage quietly. There's no excessive hitting and bashing of cattle. My eyesight's not real good there, but he'll also have, you can see there's 2 matadors on the ground that are broken open, so he will go through before he starts the kill every night. He will crack those open, make sure that they're serviceable and that they're in good working order, and that the second one is not seized or there's not any problems there. His data mars, his scanner, he's got his Android phone, and that way we know each night before the slaughter begins that everything's right to roll. And the last photo there finally is just, we started with CCTV throughout our facilities back in 2013. It was one of the ways that we, before it was a requirement, it was a very good way for us to be in any part of the country, or let alone sitting here now, and we could dial in on our phones or on our iPads, and we could look at the lairage, we could look at the knocking box, we could look at the race leading up to the lairage and also the kill floor. It was a very good way to log in at any given point of the night to any facility just to check and see what's going on. And there's nothing better than being able to pick up the phone and yell down the phone to someone and say, top up the feed, top up the water, or something's going wrong. But we very quickly also realised that the CCTV it's labour intensive. It requires a lot of people to keep monitoring that all the time. And I guess out of a need to be a little bit more mobile, we've developed a handheld app on the phone, and that's an example. The photo on the right is of the photo that's provided back with each and every animal that's killed every night. So as you can see, it's got the RFID, it's got the date, the time, it's got the name of the abattoir, and it's got the GPS coordinates. So we know that is exactly where that animal was killed, and it's not happened somewhere else. So, and I guess that's the big thing, to leave a message with, I guess here, maybe for the department, because we were talking about this earlier in some of our meetings, was that SCAS is always evolving. It's always got to evolve. As a market evolves, SCAS has got to be able to evolve with it, and it needs to be flexible. And so, we're embarking on reviewing some of our systems and control standards, because we know that no one system is perfect, and some are more expensive than others, and some are more time take a lot more to run. So we're trying to embark upon adopting a system and a set of standards that will make it better for everyone, not only exporters, but also the importer, and also the Department of Agriculture as well, from the point of auditing and that sort of thing. So I guess that's one of the biggest things going forward, is just that it's always evolving.
Thanks, Bernie. Fantastic. Thanks, Bernie. I think that covered everything particularly well, and I think you summed it up very well at the end. So that'll finish us off in this session. I'd like to thank the 3 guys up here for their contribution and their time today, and hopefully you've got a better idea of how those segments fit together and how they operate in practice. So thanks a lot, guys. I'll just keep going. Yep. So as we move straight into the next session, I'd like to ask the committee chairs to come up and grab a seat. So the next session, what we're looking at here is basically discussing what are we doing as an industry to capture trade opportunities. And as we just heard before, it's not as simple as just opening a market and going in there. There's a range of different elements that contribute to being able to access and trade, including ESCAS, including welfare, including animal health. So in order to capture those opportunities, we need structures and systems that provide the strategic direction for us, but are responsive enough to take advantage of the immediate opportunities and issues that come up. In this regard, we have a range of industry committees that are working together in different areas to fill that role. And today we're joined by the chairs and members of the Livestock Export Research and Development Advisory Committee, the Protocol Committee and the Breeding Livestock Committee. And each of them will be taking us through briefly what their committees do, and then we'll have 10 or 20 minutes at the end to talk through some of the ways that plays out between them. So firstly, to move straight into it, I'd like to ask Dr. Richard Trivett to come up and talk about LERDAC. Richard has over 40 years' experience in livestock export trade, has been a member of LERDAC for over 18 years and a chairman since 2001. So he's covered the portfolio for a long time. So Richard, if you can come up, thanks.
Thanks. You going to work that? Thanks, Wayne. Look, just a little bit of preliminary information about the R&D committee. I don't think there's any doubt that over the years the R&D committee has been a significant buttress for quite a few of the problems that we confront. You know, we're an industry that seems to have a regular supply of problems to overcome, and I guess that's we're not the only industry that occurs in, but we do come under a fair bit of pressure from time to time in relation to mainly animal welfare, and I guess the R&D committee over the years has contributed a lot to solving a lot of our problems. The key strategies that form the basis of the committee are animal health and welfare, and you'll see when I get on to the next slide just the significance of those issues. But we also look at supply chain efficiencies and regulatory performance, and also market access issues. We were talking today about some of the problems that we're having in Vietnam at the moment, and getting ourselves organised on how we address some of those issues, and we'll be looking forward to probably an R&D project to look into some of those issues in the near future. So going on to the next stage and the amount of expenditure, our program annually is round about a total of $2.5 million. You can see from there the significance of animal welfare, or animal health and welfare, takes up the bulk of it. I think I probably should mention, I don't know whether it's coming up later, I don't think it is, that our funding, the federal government provides 50% of our funding, and in round figures, although it does vary from time to time due to some extraordinary circumstances that we have to confront, that roughly a quarter of the funding comes from MLA, and the other quarter comes from levies for the live export. But that's roughly the extent of the expenditure. The R&D program is run, it's I guess we can call her the CEO, Sharon Dundon. She does a very good job organising the committee. We have a management committee that organises the program. We have a project consultative committee as well, and the R&D committee meets 3 times a year, I think, doesn't it, Wayne? Yeah, 3 times a year. There is also a management committee, which is a smaller group made up of members from on the committee that meet sort of on a regular monthly basis to discuss projects and progress. As far as the makeup of the R&D committee is concerned, it's probably not surprising that it's made up of a mix of producers, exporters, and other operatives that we get involved. And you can see from there, on the producer side of things, we have the Cattle Council, the Sheep Meats Council. We also, and I don't know whether it's clearly there, we have a Northern Beef representative on the committee. We also have a goat industry representative on the committee, and also shipping operators, air freighters, and I'd just like to pay particular reference. It's referred to there as VET, Independent Technical Member, a fellow David Kennedy, who's been with our committee now for I can't remember how long, 5 or 6 years. David's a totally independent technical person who looks very critically at our activities and gives us some tremendous advice on how we progress. Just quickly, and I won't take too much time, how the program operates, but we get presented with project concepts. They can come from anywhere really, but invariably exporters, people working within the industry who come up with ideas. The project concepts arrive, terms of reference are developed, and there is a process that we run through the management committee and the LERDAC committee to finally commission the work to be done, and final reports get published. Just to give you a quick idea on beef, on some of the projects that we are involved in, an enormous amount of work's been done on providing beef cattle breeding materials. The knowledge that we have are developed into manuals to provide assistance, mainly for the importing countries where the livestock are sent to, and a lot of that material is also provided in different languages in various forms. Just to mention a couple of the signature projects, I guess, that we've been involved in over the years. We are well on the way, and look, I can't remember how long it's taken, but it's certainly taken, well, getting towards 7 or 8 years to develop a salmonella vaccine to be administered through the water supply. Now that's a project that's been going on for a long time, but it is progressing very well, and we are at the stage now where the vaccine has been developed. Merck Sharp and Dome, or MSD, they've taken up the challenge to develop the vaccine further and to do field trials, and I think we're expecting by 2019 that we will have a working salmonella vaccine, and it doesn't happen often, but I guess it's the ultimate. If we could get a commercially viable result from one of our research programs, that's a real feather in the cap, and we look as though we're going to achieve that as far as the salmonella vaccine is concerned. A couple of iconic R&D programs that we've developed over the years. People who've been involved in the industry would know the term hot stuff. Now that's a heat stress assessment program that's been developed over a large number of years. I don't know exactly how much it's cost, but it's cost many millions of dollars to get to the stage where the program certainly has made our industry a lot more sustainable in making sure that the animals, when they're loaded at densities that ensure that I'm not sure, 99% of the cases, we get them there, even though often they are exposed to significant heat stress. The other one that there's been some discussion about today in the other industry meetings is what we call LGAP, which is a program to take over the administration of SCAS, a quality assurance program, and the industry did decide today that they would be progressing with the implementation of LGAP. That'll give us an independent authority to oversee our SCAS development, and hopefully mean that in the future, when it comes to issues of traceability and whatever in our supply chains, that we're well equipped to assess the problems and handle them in a meaningful way. So look, I think that's probably enough from me. I think R&D, it's the cornerstone of ensuring that we do have a sustainable industry. We take it very seriously. The industry, together, I've mentioned before, with the government and producer groups through MLA, put many dollars into it, and I guess the plan is for that to continue. It's an ongoing process. So I think I've said enough, Wayne, and look for the next section.
Thanks, Richard. So moving on now to the Breeding Livestock Committee, I'd like to invite up Cameron Hall. Cameron has a long history in the trade and he's got extensive experience across the live export and ag sectors.
Thanks, Wayne. So I'll just quickly run through what has traditionally been. There we go. All right. What has traditionally been a little less formal than either the R&D committee or the protocol committee. It's really come about as the trade in breeding livestock has continued to grow over the years, and particularly in more recent years around dairy and beef breeding cattle, but breeding sheep and goats as well. The aim is really to discuss the issues relating to market access, export certification, pedigree arrangements and R&D priorities specifically for breeding livestock. It provides a communications platform for setting program priorities, and it's an avenue for industry consultation around those particular markets, and particularly where there are a number of exporters that focus principally on breeding livestock. Oop, there we go. Sorry, one too many. So effectively, it's a very open membership. It includes all interested exporters of breeding livestock, beef, cattle, dairy cattle, sheep and goats. There's a joint chair role between myself and also with LiveCorp, and Wayne and Sam Brown fill that role. We meet via teleconference mostly and infrequently face-to-face, but as needed on very specific issues. And it's probably become a more regular meeting structure over the last couple of years, where over the last financial year we've had 7 meetings. I guess the key areas of focus at the moment have been around dairy pedigree certification, and particularly with moves or suggestions from Chinese authorities to increase the percentage of a shipment required to have full 3-generation pedigrees as part of that shipment. On the Angus or beef pedigree certification, again, that's coming out of the Chinese market, where there would appear to be a push to move to greater than 20% of what we call Category 1 animals, which are effectively stud animals, where 3 generations of both sides, dam and sire sides, are required to make up that number. And that's really in relation to domestic requirements in the importing markets and their views or their, I guess, their definitions of what they regard as breeding livestock. Outside of that, particularly around overseas veterinarian oversight of consignment preparation for breeding livestock, animal welfare, where there's been some work done on stock take reports, looking at welfare aspects in importing countries for breeding livestock, and there's a bit more work to be done there. Market access and also regulation. One of the challenges is also getting this to work. One of the challenges is that invariably there hasn't been a statutory levy in place for the largest portion of livestock that have been exported under breeding banner over the last few years, being dairy livestock. There's a voluntary levy. We are moving toward a statutory levy, but it's at snail's pace and it's a long process to go through. And I know all of you from the department would understand what I'm talking about. It is a very long process to get that in place. But we're moving toward that. And that does create some financial constraints on the types of programs and the level of resource and the level of funding that can be put into those particular markets and those programs. And it's also, I guess, an issue around the export of breeding goats, breeding sheep, beef cattle and dairy cattle are all very different. They all have their own unique nuances and own requirements, and the markets are often very different as well. So it's a quite a broad area, but all very unique. But I think the key benefits that it does provide and what it's starting to provide is really a basis for coordination of breeding livestock related issues rather than what was previously quite an ad hoc approach. It's delivered a platform that's facilitated broader industry consultation with the dairy industry and certainly more recently with Angus Australia to work through issues, to work through ideas and to work through developments around pedigree certification. And in particular markets, pedigree certification is critical around the volume of livestock that we can export to those markets, but it's not necessarily critical to producers in Australia. But it's critical to maintain access to those markets and to deliver what the customers and what the importing country requires. And more, I guess, more moving forward, it's provided a base or a framework around, once the statutory levies are in place, how monitoring of work programs and designing of those work programs can be undertaken. So I think that's all from me. Wayne? Thank you.
Thanks, Cameron. The next speaker is Adam Armstrong, the Managing Director of the Lembira Group. They're an extensive air export of livestock, and Adam is a member of the Protocol Committee where he sat for the last few years. Adam.
Thanks, Wayne. The Protocol Committee serves a very essential purpose in the whole framework of industry and governmental collaboration. I mean, the Protocol Committee was designed to effectively provide guidance to biosecurity in the department when they're negotiating protocols with other governments. And not only providing guidance and making sure that the finite resources that government has and also industry bodies have are sort of executed in an effective manner. There are numerous requests to the department and to industry for protocols to be negotiated from all over the world. So what the committee does as a whole is we assess those requests and prioritise them basically. The structure of the committee is, as mentioned before, you've got animal biosecurity, you've got members from the live export department operations, you've got industry representatives being long haul, sea freight, sheep, cattle, breeding, feeder, slaughter, the whole gamut. So it's a very broad church. We also have the peak industry bodies, Cattle Council, Sheep Meat Council, sit on that. And so when something gets filtered into the, sorry, I should be doing this, into the committee level, it's discussed at length, and we'll measure the benefits that we can potentially get commercially against the effort that the department has to put in. So it's a pretty neat little fun committee to be on. We meet twice a year. We meet and we talk regularly on email and also telecon as needed. And generally it's a fairly well ordered type committee, but occasionally we'll have urgent matters to attend to. The Indonesian government will introduce out of the blue a new requirement, and all of a sudden we have to scramble and work out how we're going to respond, and the ramifications that if we don't respond, if we respond in a manner which they're not happy with. Because I mean, if we get it wrong, the trade can actually to that market can stop or can be severely impacted. There's also a lot of cost benefit to what we do when we're assessing protocols. We'll have governments will make suggestions in regard to what they want to see from their side, but and our department, without the advice from us, the industry guys may well agree to something that has, you know, significant commercial ramifications to industry, or basically, you know, we just can't find animals that fit that bill. So generally when two governments negotiate a protocol, it's because there's a willingness and a need for that transaction to take place. So that Australian animal, whatever it is, a breeder, sheep to Russia, for instance, they want them and our government wants to send them there. But if we can't have a protocol that is workable and effective and can't find that article as a result, there's no point to this happening. So, hang on. Where am I pointing? So basically, the way that we work through the opportunities as they present is ease of negotiation, likelihood of success, and I guess commercial outcomes. And so, depending on those criteria, we'll prioritise as a priority 1, priority 2. There will be some items, for instance, that are on priority 1, and then we get stalled. There's a hiccup from the other end, another government, and that may well slip down to a priority 2 until such time that we can get some headway. Or if it's a market like Indonesia or China, it will sit in priority 1 and will just be worked on continually until such a time that we can get a result, or at least keep it in the face of the government at the other end, because of the importance that particular sector will have to the trade. This is basically just the process of how we achieve that. Market opportunities come via a number of different means. Quite often it's an importer coming to an exporter saying, we want this. Or it could be a foreign government going to our government and saying, we want to instigate the trade in breeding sheep to Russia, for instance. Or it may well come through one of our peak industry bodies who get approaches either from government agencies or similar peak industry bodies in other countries. So basically, it comes in the funnel and comes through to the committee level, and we throw it all around and jointly agree on how we're going to attack it and go from there. And I guess critical in this whole process is LiveCorp and MLA, because they actually do a lot of the initial grunt work and technical work before it even gets to the department, or in conjunction with the department. So it's something, yeah. And really, basically, this is just a bit of an example of, I guess, priority markets that have or have not succeeded. But for instance, the Mexican market was one was priority 1 for a long time, but and governments were willing to make it happen, but due to commercial factors, it stalled and it sat there, so it got moved to priority 2. Then all of a sudden there was a foreign exchange rate improvement in Mexico, and in no time we had it prioritised at 1, and then a workable protocol, and 6,000 cattle have gone there in no time at all. So it's a fairly responsive committee. If there's an urgent need, we can jump on it and get things happening and get trade happening. Anyway, thanks very much.
Thanks, Adam. Don, if you'll come up.
Thanks, Wayne. Thanks, gentlemen, for your input. Going to move to questions from the floor, and I believe there are some there already. Is that correct, Imogen? No? I thought there was a hand somewhere earlier. No? So questions for any of the three gentlemen, Wayne included. Early afternoon tea, is it? Right, go for it. Take the mic.
We might just sort of put them. We've obviously got three committees sitting up here, but the interaction between them is obviously an important part. Maybe Cameron, from the breeding livestock one, it's the one that's probably doesn't have the sitting members, but how do you interact with the R&D space? How do you interact with the market access space?
Yeah, look, thanks, Wayne. It's an interesting process because initially, and in many cases, when we initially get an inquiry around breeding livestock, there won't be an established protocol. It will be a new market, so we'll have to go through that process to establish a protocol, and that can take a period of time. So there's an important interaction there, and then as we move into and develop trade in that market, then of course there's all of the requirements around providing education, information, materials, those sorts of things that flow through from the work that's been done in the R&D committee. So it's not just it's a process that comes almost through that pipeline to then being able to get the initial inquiry to a point where you can actually conduct commercial business, but with the knowledge and the materials and the support mechanisms that allow it to occur in a sensible and a safe way.
Thanks. Thanks, Cam. Further questions? Heather.
This is for all three committees, so it's Heather Neal from the RSPCA. So in opening up a new breeder market, to what degree is there an analysis of the capacity of that country to actually manage those animals, not only while they're breeding animals, but in their later life?
Look, I think in response to that question, the issues that determine the preparedness or the necessary preparedness of countries to import stock, they're not particularly issues that these particular committees address. All of us now in exporting cattle to various markets, right, we're aware of the SCAS system in relation to feeder and slaughter cattle, but to answer your question, Heather, and, you know, I'll just cite an example that a company that I'm involved with has had a lot to do with, and that's to do with putting dairy heifers into Pakistan. It's a very good market for us, but one of the biggest issues that we have to confront in getting those cattle in there is to, I can tell you, spend sometimes months working with genuine importers to import cattle into those countries and to ensure that they're prepared to receive them. You know, also as far as exporting them, we're not in a position to get an export permit to export them until the preparedness of the entities receiving the cattle are well documented and presented to the Department of Agriculture before export permits are issued. So, as I say, a lot of work goes into getting the importing countries prepared to receive the cattle and to ensure that they are well prepared for and handled. Now, your question is to how far down the line you can go, and I'm not sure whether you mentioned the full life of the animal, but one thing that you do know is that you have to follow through for quite a while, when I say quite a while, for years, on helping the importers of these cattle look after them. So, look, I don't know whether that answers the question, but a lot of work goes into ensuring that the importers of these cattle are prepared to receive them.
Thanks.
Comments?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks, Don. Heather, there's been quite a bit of work done and continuing to be done around the types of requirements around due diligence of not only the importing country but the importing entity itself, in terms of the facilities that are available, the types of handling infrastructure that's there, the ability of management to be able to manage and care for those animals appropriately. And where we're heading towards with that is a set of policies that revolve around breeding livestock, to ensure that due diligence checklist and that due diligence work is done, it's recorded, it's provided as part of the process that goes and is approved by the department to allow those particular shipments to be conducted.
Further questions? No? All good? Any closing comments, gentlemen? Wayne? All comfortable?